Well, welcome back to Tabitha, a life sown with grace. And today we arrive at the turning point in the story of Tabitha. The atmosphere in Joppa has been heavy with grief, and the widows are mourning. The upper room is filled with sorrow, and the women who had spent her life helping others now lies silent. But then something happens. Hope begins moving towards the house. And today's episode is called Faith Walks Into the House. And this story reminds us that when situations feel impossible, faith still dares to seek God. Acts 9:38-40 says, Since Lydia was near Joppa, the disciples, hearing that Peter was there, sent two men to him, urging him, Please come to us without delay. So Peter rose and went with them. But Peter put them all outside, and he knelt down and prayed. See, these verses are full of urgency, desperation, and fragile hope. And Tabitha has already died. And yet the believers still send for Peter. That decision alone tells us that something very powerful, that faith was still alive in the middle of the grief. And from a human perspective, the situation seemed over. Tabitha was gone, the room was filled with mourning, and the future felt uncertain. Yet someone said, Send for Peter. I love that because it shows us that even devastated people can still reach for hope. The believers in Joppa had likely witnessed miracles before, and they had seen God move through the apostles. And even though they did not know what would happen, they refused to surrender completely to despair. Faith often looks like reaching out before you have the answers, not because you understand everything, but because you still believe that God is able. You have you ever reached a point where you quietly stopped hoping? Maybe disappointment exhausted you. A prayer went unanswered, a situation worsened, a relationship broke, or a door closed. And over time, your expectation became smaller. But this story gently asked us, what if hope still has room to breathe? The believers could have accepted defeat immediately. Instead, they acted in faith. And sometimes faith simply means taking one more step towards God when everything in you feels tired. This story also reveals the beauty of intercessory faith. The disciples did not merely grieve privately, they acted on behalf of one another. They sought help, they sent messengers, and they carried the burden together. So that's why intercession is standing in the gap for someone else. And honestly, many of us are here today because someone prayed for us. A parent, a grandparent, a friend, a pastor, or a spouse. Someone kept believing when we were weak. And the church at Joppa demonstrated the power of collective faith. Sometimes that we cannot carry our burdens alone. We need people who will say, I will pray with you, I believe with you, and I'll stand beside you. Who are you interceding for right now? Who needs your prayers, your encouragement, your faith? And on the other side, who are you allowing to support you? Sometimes pride isolates us in suffering, but spiritual family matters because God often strengthens people through one another. The believers in Joppa understood this. They moved together towards hope. One of the most beautiful moments in this passage happens quietly. Peter enters the room. He sees the sorrow. He feels the emotional weight. And before speaking to Tabitha, he kneels down and prays. That detail matters deeply. Peter had seen Jesus perform miracles, and Peter himself had experienced God's power. Yet he still understood the miracle would not come from him. So he prayed first. Prayer is an act of dependence, and it reminds us that human strength has limits, but God does not. And perhaps many of us rush too quickly into the anxiety, fixing and controlling, or striving before we actually stop enough to pray. And Peter teaches us another way. Pause, kneel, seek God first. That is your first instinct in difficult situations. So do you panic, overthink, or try to control everything? Or do you pray? See, prayer does not always immediately change circumstances, but prayer changes the atmosphere of our hearts. So it reconnects us to God's presence, His wisdom, His peace. And often the greatest act of faith is not the dramatic action, it's the quiet dependence. At this stage of the story, nothing has changed outwardly yet, but Tabitha is still lying there. The widows are still grieving, and the answers has not yet arrived. But prayer has entered the room, and that matters because impossible moments are often where faith grows deepest. Anyone can trust God when outcomes feel secure, but trusting Him in uncertainty requires surrender. Peter knelt because he believed God was still able to move, not because circumstances looked promising, but because God's power is not limited by our human impossibility. And perhaps someone listening today needs that reminder that God is still able to strengthen weary hearts, able to restore hope, and able to provide peace, able to work in ways that you cannot see, even now. So maybe there is something that you have stopped praying about entirely. A family member, healing, reconciliation, a dream, a season of pain. Disappointment can slowly silence prayer, but this story invites us to pray again. Not because prayer gives us control over outcomes, but because prayer keeps our hearts connected to hope. And sometimes faith simply whispers, Lord, I still trust you. And here's today's reflection question. What situation have you stopped praying about? Take a quiet moment. And what burden have you emotionally given up on? And what impossible situation have you stopped bringing before God? Could today be an invitation to trust Him again, not with forced certainty, but with renewed openness to His presence and power? And so when Peter entered the upper room, faith entered with him. Not loud faith, not perfect faith, but praying faith, dependent faith, persistent faith. And that kind of faith still changes lives today. Faith keeps praying, faith keeps hoping, and faith keeps turning towards God even in the impossible moments. So whatever room that you are sitting in today, a grieving room, a waiting room, or a fearful room, do not stop praying, because sometimes hope arrives quietly, one prayer at a time. So Lord, strengthen our faith in difficult seasons. Help us keep turning towards you even when the situation feels impossible. And teach us to pray before we panic, and surround us with people who will stand beside us spiritually. And for every burden that we have stopped praying about, awaken hope in us again. Remind us that you are still present, still listening, and still able. Amen. So thank you for joining me in today's podcast of Tabitha, A Life Sown with Grace. Tomorrow we witness the miracle itself in the Tabitha Arise, and discover what resurrection hope can teach us about restoration, renewal, and life-giving power of God. So until then, keep stitching grace into the world around you.